welcome to webinar 4 in our series of 6, which are exploring evidence-informed approaches to the teaching of reading. Today, we're really delighted that we're going to be hearing from a couple of schools in our region. So first up will be St Cadoc's Catholic Primary School from Cardiff, and then we'll be hearing from St Cyri's Comprehensive in the Vale of Glamorgan, and both of whom have developed their own pedagogy for vocabulary instruction to suit their own contexts. Gordon, if we could have a look at slide 2. Thank you. Brilliant. So you'll be aware, if you've attended any of the previous sessions, that the whole series is underpinned and informed by Hollis Scarborough's work as represented in the Scarborough's reading rope. So this visual representation unpicks the different elements that are necessary for reading proficiency. Our first 2 sessions looked at the lower half of the rope, which is to do with word recognition and decoding, while our last session last week looked at the top half around language comprehension and how we support learners to become effective comprehenders of text. On the next slide, this is where we are today. We're developing and zooming in on the role of vocabulary and the importance of vocabulary within that process of developing proficient readers. It's something that we touched on in the last session because it is such a key element of comprehension. But as I say, in this session, we're going to look at it in more detail, spend a bit more time on it. So why is vocabulary so important? Why does it kind of merit its own strand in the reading rope? If we think about it, knowledge of words and knowledge of the meaning of those words is central to understanding whole texts and their meaning, and therefore of being able to access the curriculum as a whole. But we know that there is an equity in the richness of our learners' vocabulary, or word hoard, as Alex Quigley calls it here. And if we don't intentionally address that within school, then that inequity will only increase, as those who have the vocabulary to access the curriculum will just continue to develop their vocabulary and their knowledge, while those who don't will develop more slowly. This is often referred to as the Matthew effect, a sort of biblical reference, talking about the idea that unto those that have, more will be given, but for those who have not, what they have shall be taken away. So a lot of what we're talking about today is attempting to address that word gap and that knowledge gap, and develop equity in our reading provision. And the next slide, this is something that we expand on within our own Words Matter PL. So this is available via the CSC website as an asynchronous assignment, and it supports the key messages you'll be hearing now really from our 2 schools today. So without any further ado, I will hand you over to Rachel Fisher, who is head teacher at St Cadoc's Catholic Primary School, and Rachel is going to share from her own laptop, we hope. Rach, over to you.
We do hope. Let's hope the technology does what I hope it's going to do now. Okay. So can everybody see the front page? Explicit vocabulary teaching, raising reading standards at St Cadoc's.
Looks good. Is
that viewable to everybody? Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks very much everybody to coming along and listening to what what we do here at St Cadoc's. I'll try and make it helpful and interesting for you, and I apologise in advance if my inner reading geek comes out, because when it comes to the topic of reading acquisition in education, it's a particular focus of mine personally since I began teaching almost 20 years ago. So basically this presentation looks to outline our own approach to vocabulary teaching, which is underpinned by research. You know, we don't claim to have invented any of this. We've, you know, looked into some really clever people and what they think about vocabulary and why they think it's important. It's aligned with our vision as a school. So I'm going to give you hopefully a little taster of what it is that we do here, and why we think, you know, vocabulary is so important, linking to a lot of what Andy just said. So just to give you a little bit of school context, so we have 340 pupils on roll. We have 41% free school meals. We have 24% of our children identify English as an additional language. We actually think that's more like 50%, but we have some parents that choose to put English as their first language. An interesting stat, if you don't know, so Llanrumney, where the school is situated, there is a Welsh index of multiple deprivation, and it's ranked between 1 being the most deprived and 1,099 score being the least deprived. And Llanrumney, our postcode of our school and our catchment area, is number 7. So in terms of the level of deprivation and social challenges our children face, you know, it is quite significant. We would consider ourselves to be a knowledge-rich school. That doesn't mean we don't develop skills and experiences, but we want our children to know lots of things. We have a high aspiration for academic success because we believe that a good standard of academic success leads to improved well-being for pupils, particularly coming from this type of area. And the school has exemplary behaviour, and we have exceptional care for our pupils as well. You know, we're on a mission in this school to raise the best children that we possibly can to allow them to be aspirational. And we've also recently had an arrested inspection. So that's just, not that that's the be all and end all, but it's also important to note that we just had that in the autumn term. So this is basically the research that shapes our practice about vocabulary in particular, but it also drives a huge amount of our curriculum planning work related to literacy. So the thing that was key in our focus on vocabulary was Reading Reconsidered, and the work of Doug Lemov. Why Knowledge Matters by Hirsch, that drives a lot of our curriculum thinking and why knowledge is so important. And then obviously vocabulary, it is knowledge, isn't it? It is what things are called, it's what things mean, it's how we access our world. And then the specific work of Isabel Beck then of how you actually instruct children in how to acquire vocabulary. So those are 3 key things. When I first went into teaching, if I ever went on a course and I'd been suggested, you know, a book, I used to think, oh, like, when have I ever got time to read anything like that? But actually, in the last 10 years in particular, there are certain books that have been instrumental in changing the way I thought about things, because, you know, maybe I thought I knew something. So these are really helpful books. They're not particularly lengthy, and they're pretty easy to read. So as a starting point, that's where I would suggest you head. So why is explicit vocabulary teaching so important to us? So when we decided that this is something we needed to be intentional on, these are the things that research and our own understanding would tell us. So if children have explicit vocabulary teaching, if they have a good and robust knowledge and application of vocabulary, it unlocks their ability to comprehend text. It builds fluency, not only in their technical ability to read, but also their fluency when they come to words that they maybe don't know, or if they're trying to read text about a topic that they're unsure of, it builds fluency. It deepens their understanding of not only text, but the world and what things mean and how you can put things in context. It expands their knowledge of how you might use words. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about the types of words that we teach when and how important that is for developing, you know, levels of knowledge as they get older. Cultural literacy, which is linked to what Andy had said about the Matthew model. It's probably underestimated by those of us that have got, you know, family setups that, you know, where we've had good experiences and we get taken places and shown things and talked to. In areas particularly of deprivation, where there is a lack of communication, a poor standard of oracy, maybe a lack of qualifications, or a lack of, you know, professional work potentially, or no work at all, having the confidence to be able to converse with people that do maybe have a range of experiences, that prevents children having the confidence to go out and do other things outside of their community. We believe that and know that. So when you know lots of words and you can converse and you know lots of things, it gives you the confidence then to be able to hold your own, in various different settings in life. And that's the massive impact that it has, particularly on disadvantaged children, because they don't necessarily get those opportunities from home. It's really important that we provide it as a school. So how we teach it at the vocabulary at St Cadoc's, and this is something I would just ask you to reflect on, is that we have an intentional pedagogy for vocabulary. So you have in your curriculum an intentional focus on that. It doesn't matter if you don't, but if you've never thought about it, maybe it's worth thinking about. Do you know what words you're teaching? Do you know when you're teaching them? How do you know that the pupils are remembering them and practicing them? Do you know what context they're using them in? So that's why we wanted to have a set pedagogy for vocabulary, because that's how important we believe it to be. And it doesn't really matter what that pedagogy ends up being, as long as there's some type of intent in, we want the children to know this set of words because it's this important. So basically there's 6 key things that I'm going to try and whiz through to give you a flavour of what that intentional approach to vocabulary looks like. So we practice direct instruction. So we use direct teaching methods with children to vocabulary. There are certain words, there's tier 1, 2, 3 words in the language that we use, and we believe that there's certain words that children just will not pick up by osmosis. That they will pick up some, but they have to be taught. They have to be shown, they have to hear it. So we are very, very intentional in instructing children about vocabulary and how we model it. And we think those are essential for academic success. So an example on the side at the moment. So we have a knowledge organizer that starts all our topics. It doesn't necessarily, it's not theme based. So this is one for narratives from a year 3-4 class. So on every knowledge organizer is a word mat. So those are the words that we're going to try and practice and use. And then even in the explanation of other things that are going to be included, we don't shy away from the vocabulary. We don't try and simplify the language. If we want them to use it, then we give it to them. And then we expect them to use it and we practice it alongside them. So that goes out at the start of a topic, it gets referred to through the topic, the children stick it in their books, they can refer back to it, the teacher refers back to it. So that's how intentional, we are when it comes to, well, these are how important these words are. And then the next thing is active practice then. So we ensure that the children practice the vocabulary that we identify continuously. So it's repetition and application. So we always say with vocabulary, and this is everybody from a 3-year-old in the nursery to an 11-year-old in year 6, if you introduce a word, they've got to say it, they've got to write it, and they've got to use it. Doesn't necessarily mean they do all 3 in one lesson, although when we teach it explicitly, they probably do. But that's the idea behind it. If you teach them a word, if you come across something, say it, write it, use it in a variety of contexts, in a variety of ways. So I just put an example there on the next slide. This is a forces knowledge organizer. I don't know why it's cut off the words there slightly on the left. So those are all the key vocabulary from the forces. And then I'm going to come back to the work you can actually see is from a year 4 class, where they've had to make some notes about some of the vocabulary during a lesson. But then there's also more blatant things. If we've taught them a set of words, so this is looking at, morphology and trying to look at suffixes, get them to write it in a sentence, get them to talk about it, get them to practice the sentence. Some things are really simple. They're 2-minute activities, because let's be honest, who's got, the curriculum is packed and we've got a lot to do. So sometimes it's just a quick activity, but it's all ways to practice the continuous options there for children to practice what it is that we're teaching them. So the idea of pre-teach, reteach is something that's become harder for us to do as a school, because pre-teaching and reteaching obviously needs extra adults to be able to do it, but we have become smarter, COVID actually did help with that. So when we talk about pre-teach and reteach, we're quite conscious of children's working memory, anybody's working memory being actually quite small. So any new concept or idea or any point in learning, generally children can hold on to about 2 or 3 things. So in lessons, accidentally, we tend to overload the working memory and then they can't hold on to certain things. So with pre-teach and reteach, we give the children the vocabulary in advance in a variety of different ways. So you've seen the knowledge map there, but also in our planning as teachers, we at the start of a lesson, so this would be part of our script for a topic. It's a non-fiction about animals, and this comes from a year 1-2. So those are the types of level of vocabulary that a year 1-2 class in this school is looking at, and it identifies where in the text on the page numbers, as you can see, where those words are going to come in. So that would be given out, but it also would be recorded by the teacher, placed onto Google Classroom. Children can listen to the definitions. If there's a TA with a group that we think are probably going to struggle because it's quite a wide variety of vocabulary, the TA would work with them first. They would go through, they play a few games, matching games. They would talk about the words. They would give examples of the words. Then the lesson would be taught, and those children maybe that require things a few more times, they're then sitting in the lesson thinking, oh, actually, I do know the word cold-blooded, and I have heard the word crocodile, and I have heard the word scale before. So that then reduces the impact on the working memory, and it also then aids that transition then into the long-term memory because they're doing it several times in several different ways. And obviously for children in foundation, it is all about doing the same thing in lots of different ways to be able to move then information to the long-term memory. And then reteach then, because it's on Google Classroom, if they want to, they can listen to it when they're home, they can log into it, they can use it on an iPad in continuous provision, they can make labels. So those types of things, those types of ideas are really key. And then, so the next 3 are they're sort of linked, but they're sort of not. So explicit and implicit instruction, when you talk about teaching vocabulary, you can teach it explicitly on its own, you can teach it implicitly on its own, but we advocate a use of a mixture. So sometimes in explicit instruction, we are just focusing on words. The intent of the lesson is we're going to focus on these 5 words, and then we're going to look at them in a variety of contexts, and we're going to do lots of practice about them. And then implicit instruction is just where we build it into our daily routines. So we might mention certain words when we're reading about something. We might highlight words that we've maybe focused on. So in a primary school, a mixture of explicit and implicit is important because children need variety. It can be quite intensive if you're just learning about 4 sets of words. So we tend to use that with a mixture of implicit, where we just come across it in different settings. So that's just an example there of some of the explicit words that we might use on the topic of forces. So that's part of the year 3 and 4. And then that's an example from our script there of how we actually would go about teaching with the vocabulary in mind explicitly. And then later on in the lesson, then it becomes implicit because they're using it in a variety of ways. So a good example of that I said I would refer back to. So when they're talking about forces in the year 4 class, 3-4, the teacher's talking about forces, and then the children are encouraged to make notes then. So they're picking up certain things that the teacher might say, they've got the word mat in front of them, and then they make notes that make sense to them. That's not marked, it's not like that we check it, they pick up those certain bits of information that they can come back and forth to. And then the last thing then is the focus on tier 2 and 3 words. So tier 1 words, if you don't know, are basic everyday words that most pupils will acquire naturally through conversation. Things like house or water or run. Those are things that children will pick up. Tier 2 are high utility words. They're words that we will use and they will appear across a variety of texts, but they often require more direct instruction because unless you tell them what it means, and practice it, they won't necessarily be able to pick that up just from the context of the sentence. So we focus a lot on tier 2 words here, and that the tier 2 words are for everybody. So it's not just, oh, these children we think are capable. Everybody gets exposure to it in an equal measure, because why should only some children know it and not others? Just because they can't necessarily repeat it straight away, it doesn't mean they can't hear it and be explained to them. And then tier 3 words then are significant and subject specific. So we also think about those and we plan those in. We make sure we make the time to look at those things. And there's a couple of examples there of where we might do that. And that's the example of where you start to get things in writing, things like eventually, unfortunately, realize. So, that's a good level of writing with some of those tier 2 words included in it. So these then a couple of, I'm going to sort of very light touch go over some of these. So some of these strategies about vocabulary come from Reading Reconsidered, which we've had some professional learning on from CSC. And then some of them are, general strategies that we've picked up in, from that research. So it's a focus of vocabulary in every lesson. Vocabulary is king in whatever subject. We identify the words and we keep coming back to them all the time, and we insist that children use them, and we insist they use them correctly, and we correct their pronunciation, and we ask them to put it back into a sentence if they haven't used it quite correctly. So we're quite insistent on that. So we focus on it. We identify where the words are. It's not a surprise to the teachers. They know when the word is coming in shared reading, and they try to make sure they plan that in. It comes cross-curricular, and it really helps cross-curricular work. So when we've done explicit vocabulary work in English, in our English lessons, we then find that the quality of writing across the board then is improved. So this is an example. This is a year 1 child. This is a pretty able year 1 child at the end of the summer term, talking about water, why water is good. That's part of a science lesson. So because she's had good experience with vocabulary, she's able to pick out some of those things and to be able to use them in context. So she's using the word, helpful. She's got sea creatures, and then she ends with a lovely sentence then, because without it, it would ruin the glory of the ocean. I mean, that's wonderful, isn't it? That's a really nice, sparkly sentence. And then another example then, so this is from a year 6 class in an RE lesson where they've had a focus on the word covenant. So they're trying to talk about all the things during the lesson. They will have come back to that vocabulary that's on the left here, Sinai, Grace, Moses. And then at the end of the lesson then, a 30-second exit, write me a definition of covenant in 30 words. And then this child then has done one for Noah, for Abraham. So it's all the time trying to think of interesting ways for children to practice the words that we're giving them. So knowledge building. So as I said, we try and be a knowledge-rich school. We try to pre-plan the vocabulary, and not just the vocabulary, the concepts that go with it. So this again is a year 1-2 knowledge organizer. So that, they could be considered to be quite advanced, some of the things, but why not? Why shouldn't they know about all these things? Because some children will, and some children will have these experiences. So we use a knowledge organizer, as you can see there, to give them the concept so that they can practice, they can find out about things, they can go off and find out between lessons if they want to. And then we use this as teachers then as a way to make sure we have retrieval practice, that we go back at various intervals and make sure that those children that vocabulary is moving into long-term memory then, that they can remember it after 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. And we just keep going back to them, because that's the knowledge we want them to have. That's the experience of the world we want them to have, to be able to hold their own in conversations. Just because they live in a deprived area of the city, it doesn't mean they can't know about the wonderfulness of St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey, or they can't know about the Senedd or the Wales Millennium Centre and who designed it, and Cardiff Castle and all those things. So we're quite intentional in how we build knowledge for that. And that's just another example. That's a year 3 and 4 vocabulary focus. So that's the teacher that knows during the week those are the words I'm going to try and work on. And then, it's linked to absorbent, which was part of the science topic. And they've got some examples. So again, all of that gets shared with children. It all goes home. It's all a way of trying to immerse them to get them to practice. And then the active practice, again, we do go into detail over little words, because that's what you need to do to be able to get children to acquire it. So the Treasure Island is the text you can see on the screen now. And then part of that would have been work on the word stun, which would be a tier 2 word. And then that's the level of detail they go into. That would be an example of a little, of a little set of activities they would do. So that would be the explicit instruction as part of a lesson, but implicitly the word stun is then part of the text. So you can see how there's a balance there between the two. So I thought it would be useful to put an impact on the pupil outcomes, because, again, not that it's the be all and end all, but, it is a way to measure that it is working and the impact that vocabulary has on reading. I mean, traditionally, this school has never performed particularly well in the national reading tests. Our children find it incredibly difficult, particularly since it became digital. But we have noticed an improvement, a significant improvement over the last 5 or 6 years in the reading outcomes, particularly in year 6. And our children go on a journey. They come in on a very low baseline. They don't make massive progress quickly, but they do make progress by the time they leave us. And so the example of that is that in year 6, in the summer just gone, 45 pupils and 40 of them scored over the standardized average, which, is exceptional for children that potentially came in with a low baseline. And then the 5 children that didn't all fell between 80 and 90, which again is not the lowest standardized you ever will see. And they're all children with recognized ALM. So the impact on pupils to be able to access text, because vocabulary is key and the knowledge is key. Just because they can technically decode, they've got to have knowledge behind it to be able to understand the nuances of text. And we think that the vocabulary work that we've done has been instrumental with that. And again, I wrestled with this slide because, Estin, yes, it is the thing that we sort of worry about, but it's not something that drives us here. What drives us is trying to make the best for the children. But Estin did come recently, and these are some of the things that they thought about vocabulary, that they noticed the words that were being used, that they made comments about, gosh, the children do really know technical vocabulary well. It is taught intentionally, or, the children do enjoy learning about it. It has had a big impact. It has had an impact in their writing, in their reading, in their ability to speak, to know about a topic, to be able to recall. So those things were able to be picked up because this has been a 7, 8, 9-year journey in trying to be intentional about the way we go about it here. So the key takeaways, and I know it's been an absolute whistle stop. Hopefully I'm still on time, hopefully. So the key things I would encourage for you, it's got to be a systematic approach and intentional. It doesn't matter what you do, what you decide is important, as long as you plan for it. And that would be the same for any type of school improvement priority. But make sure you have an agreed approach, get it consistent, and something that works for your 3-year-olds and 11-year-olds. Yes, you edit it in between and you make it suit, but something that's intentional for the whole school. When it comes to empowering pupils, we know and believe that disadvantaged pupils benefit the most. Advantaged pupils and pupils from affluent areas will also benefit. It's not going to harm anybody, but the gap that's caused by lack of vocabulary and reading ability particularly closes then for children that are disadvantaged, that don't necessarily have the experiences and don't have the confidence then to converse in social settings. And then it's about trying to ensure some future success. It's not just about improving their reading standards, which is undoubtedly important. It's trying to ensure future success academically, professionally, that want to then go into medicine, or they want to go into law, or they want to go into teaching, or they want to go whatever it is. If they want to be a YouTuber Okay, fine. At least you've got the language there to do it, because there's such lack of language and there's so much shorthand in the digital world. We still say to the children, you still need to be able to communicate, you still need to be able to use these words, you still need to know about things to be able to talk on YouTube if that's what you want to do. So hearing words, thinking words, rehearsing words, using words, it all builds knowledge, you know, as they go forward into adult life then. So those are my 3 takeaways. So yeah, and just a little quote there. The intentional and thoughtful teaching of vocabulary transforms readers, which I really do believe it does. And it's the bridge to comprehension and success. So I put a little time for Q&A, but there's probably not time. Hopefully I didn't go over too much.
I think there are bound to be tons of questions, I think, because of the way that you've covered it and what you've covered, whether that's like the detail of the application that you've got in your context, or the fact that you kept coming back, I think, to that bigger picture and the sort of moral imperative there of making sure that we're not leaving learners behind and that we're empowering them through language. I think it's just, yeah, it's such a powerful message to hear. Rachel, really appreciate it. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the time for it.
And I'm pretty confident that although, you know, we're moving on to a different context now, we're looking at what this might look like in a secondary context. I'm pretty confident that lots of those threads will also be picked up by Frank and by Rachel, not too far away from Cardiff, over in the Vale of Glamorgan at St Cyri's Comprehensive. So we will hand over to Frank and to Rachel.
Thank you, Andy. Can you hear us?
Loud and clear, yeah.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Andy just said, I'm Frank Rossi. I'm the LLC AOLE lead here at St Cyri's in Penarth.
And I'm Rachel Hassan, so I'm head of English.
And we're going to try to give you a very, very brief, very quick overview of our context first and how we approach vocabulary instruction here at St Cyri's. So very, very quickly, if we can move on to the next slide, thank you. St Cyri's is situated in Penarth, Vale of Glamorgan. Although we are in Penarth, our catchment area is very, very wide, very, very large. We've got 1,232 pupils on roll. FSM percentage is 16.7. We've got almost a quarter of EAL pupils from very wide variety of horizons and origins, and we've got about 15% ALN pupils. On to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to try to, I'm obviously, you know, the literacy coordinator here, but I've got my background as a language teacher. Rachel here, obviously, her background as head of English and English teacher. And what we're going to try to do is to talk about, you know, how we approach things. So the explicit teaching of vocabulary has historically been associated with second language teaching. Tools such as word maps or vocab lists or knowledge organizers are very familiar to us. It's, you know, our bread and butter. And the introduction of LLC as an area of learning within the Curriculum for Wales framework really encouraged us to explore whether and how the existing expertise in international languages and Welsh, because we approach the teaching of Welsh here in a very, very similar way to that of international languages, how that could inform our teaching of English, our teaching of vocabulary, and in turn support the teaching of vocabulary in other subjects. Next slide, please.
So when we sort of started this process, our initial kind of reading and research quickly made it clear that there was a place for the explicit teaching of vocabulary, and the really closely related issue of developing background knowledge of learners, including knowledge of words and their meanings in the English curriculum. And that without this, we were kind of doing pupils a disservice, really, by assuming that they already had, or that they would kind of pick up along the way, the necessary vocabulary to understand the complex texts that we're giving them and understand complex concepts, and to express themselves fully and articulately in academic contexts and in wider contexts outside of school and in their future sort of professional lives. So here, Daisy Christodoulou quotes from a chief examiner's report, which shows how the lack of knowledge of the word glacier led some students to sort of completely misunderstand an entire exam extract. And these sorts of gaps in knowledge can and need to be addressed through active discussion of and kind of explicit teaching of vocabulary.
Next slide, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a book that Rachel mentioned and talked about earlier. So, if you've undertaken any reading around the teaching of vocabulary, you're likely to come across Isabel Beck's name. And, Rachel has discussed the tiers of vocabulary, which Beck is sort of probably best known for. And her work gives us a really clear sense of the connection between vocabulary and academic success.
Next slide,
go on to the next slide. So really, with all of that, it can be really overwhelming to think about a starting point or a basis for which words we actually teach. But Avril Coxhead's academic word list is one starting point because it identifies words that appear regularly in academic writing, but which are non-subject specific. So tier 2 words that might be missed by subject teachers or curriculum planners that are maybe more aware of those subject specific bits of knowledge and vocabulary. So if you could move on to the next slide, sorry.
Thank you. So our starting point was to take the existing half-term plans of each subject area and work together to identify the vocabulary which those subject teachers or heads of departments saw as valuable to learners' understanding of their topic or area of focus for that half-term. And it was really interesting to see, how really subject specific some words were. For example, in Ari here, I don't know how well you can see, but some terms are really specific, and also terms like a volume, for example, which we can see on the chemistry list, which would have a completely different meaning in music, for example, and a word like corrosive, which might be used very literally in chemistry, but it would have a more metaphorical meaning in English, obviously. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we realized that there were really common challenges across all subject areas, but also specific patterns in terms of vocabulary. For a subject like history, for example, much of the challenge comes from the number of tier 2 formal words, which learners might not encounter outside of reading academic or quite sophisticated text. So, words like evidence or interpretation that we saw in the history list earlier, they're not going to crop up naturally in everyday speech. That's something that Rachel pointed out earlier. So those would need modeling and teaching. However, in a subject like maths, the challenge is quite different because words like product or integer, they have a very precise application in maths, obviously, and they need to be defined, to be understood with precision. And so it seemed that the challenge here was about depth of understanding of a smaller number of words rather than breadth of language, which obviously matters more to some of the subjects, and exposing learners to a wide range of new words. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when it comes to the teaching of vocabulary, one advantage that international languages or Welsh, as I said, have over other subjects is the fact that vocabulary or language acquisition is always tied to cultural context and real world use. So the vocabulary taught is always instantly put in use in a variety of structures and situations. So nothing ever remains vague or put aside. It's always used instantly. It's learned for a purpose, and we also very often draw links between languages, and we look at where words come from. And I remember a lesson a couple of years ago when I was teaching days of the week, meaning in French, days of the week and the month, and when we were looking at where the words came from, the origin of the words, where they actually meant. And remember people being really interested. And the same day, with their English teacher, in their English lesson, they actually were talking about mythology, so Greek mythology, talking about Greek names and Roman names and so on. And they could see instantly the connection, and they were able to draw, links and connections between what they learned in French, the French lesson in the morning, and the lesson and the learning that they were acquiring in English in the afternoon, which they were, really impressed with, really impressed with. Next slide, please.
So, that's some of the work that's been going on over the last couple of years. And more recently, as part of our kind of ongoing work with Voice 21, we have been sort of exploring the oracy-centered approach to vocab that's detailed in this voicing vocabulary report. So some of the elements that are some of the elements of sort of successful vocabulary teaching that are, sorry about the lights flashing around behind me. Some of the elements of vocabulary teaching that are explored in that report include prioritizing planning of vocabulary and planning for vocabulary explicitly, contextualizing vocabulary, that's something that has already been mentioned as really important, and being able to contextualize vocabulary through classroom talk, through discussions. And monitoring pupils' kind of ownership of their new vocabulary and encouraging pupils to kind of take ownership and build confidence with using that new vocabulary in those different contexts. The Voicing Vocabulary report points out how important it is that pupils are using classroom talk to listen to and to practice using their new vocabulary. So moving from word introduction to word ownership. This sort of regular practice of using new words, like I said, kind of helps to build confidence in pupils. That's something that we've really seen. And by achieving word ownership, they're better able to apply the vocabulary in new contexts. One of the things that we discussed in a really recent staff CPD on this was the importance of explicitly teaching vocabulary and helping pupils to both talk and write as subject experts. Remembering that pupils are, they're expected to be experts in 5 or 6 different subjects throughout the school day, as they move from lesson to lesson, encountering vocabulary in very different contexts in what they read, the text that they come across in those lessons, and what they're expected to be able to write and say as well. So the strategies that we've started to implement to help pupils to manage this are already proving really popular between and sort of amongst pupils. Their confidence with recognizing different meanings and using these words in different contexts is improving. So if on the next slide, we can see some of the tools that we've used over the last few years within the English department and within the wider school. We had sort of trialed a few different frameworks and templates for teaching vocabulary, but we really liked the approach that Reading Reconsidered used, and obviously Rachel mentioned Reading Reconsidered in her presentation earlier. So we use these vocab grids. We give students a working definition. We've also chosen to give them some of the etymology or sometimes related words that will help them to understand or apply this vocabulary more widely. And we discuss that a little bit with them. And then crucially, we give an image that represents the vocabulary. And most importantly of all, we're asking the pupils to apply that vocab in a whole sentence, in a full sentence in their own words. So this bit is really important for a few reasons. As we've kind of already covered, we're very familiar with the need to teach new vocabulary in context and to put it into practice. Vocabulary is much more likely to be retained and used accurately and precisely if it's introduced and practiced in the context of a longer phrase or sentence, rather than if it's just taught as a standalone word. So putting it into full sentences in the answer to the questions in that situation box is really important. In this example is from year 7, and as you might kind of notice in this example, we're sort of trying to attach the new vocabulary to students' existing knowledge or schema, to the kind of experiences that they're having at the moment. So for our year 7s at the start of the year, when they're starting at a brand new school, they might think about how to come across as amiable to new peers and potential friends. And at a time in their lives when they're meeting lots of new teachers and maybe being intimidated by the number of new teachers they've got in such a big school, the idea of attaching the word imposing to a teacher and thinking about why they would describe that teacher as imposing is quite likely to stick. And then often the conversations that arise from that in class kind of help to make the word more memorable. also in that second example, you know, by using an image which prompts them to think of how a building can be imposing, when they're also thinking about how a person can be imposing, you know, by doing that, they're considering how the word can be applied to different situations, how the word can be used to describe slightly different things. On the next slide, we have an example from maths, and in this example, the issue is a little bit different, because what we're trying to clarify in this example from maths is the very precise meaning and application of a word in one context, which may be used, you know, and would be used in a slightly different way in a different academic context. This is, you know, it's a common aspect that we as kind of expert readers often take for granted. You know, when we're asked to complete a cell in a spreadsheet, we're not likely to confuse that with a cell in biology. But we can't assume that our learners will be just as clear on the different meanings of an apparently simple word. And then by exploring the word's different meanings in the questions in the situation box, through questions getting them to think about the different meanings, different situations they might encounter this word, we're encouraging them to think about those words in different contexts, making the connections and thinking about the distinctions between them. On the next slide, we've got some examples of what this looks like in pupils' books, what they record in their books while completing these vocabulary grids. You know, and there would be a lot of discussion around some of these in class as well. The example on the left, variable, is from science, while the two examples on the right are taken from English. But what we can see in both of them is that they not only have a definition that they can refer to in future, but much more importantly, they've got a sentence where they've used that new vocabulary in their own words. They've taken ownership of it. They've used it to formulate their own sentence, their own answer, and then they'd be able to, you know, we have some people sharing that sentence in class where we'd be able to check that they're pronouncing the word correctly and things like that, and that they're using it in the right way in a sentence. So those examples kind of show how that looks in practice.
Okay. We move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the need, obviously, to teach new vocabulary in the context of a wider sentence is one that we're very familiar with in Welsh and in international languages. So where we use sentence builders to help encode new language in chunks rather than as individual words in a vacuum. So this is why we very, very frequently, if not constantly, we very frequently rely on scaffolding and scaffolding documents to help the students to associate certain words and phrases and to help them to connect them logically. So that's why, for example, in languages, structures are usually, and I say usually, it's 99% of the time, structures are learned before vocabulary, so that on learning the vocabulary, pupils can use it instantly. If they have the vocab but not the structure, then they can't do anything with that vocab. If they learn the structure first, they can instantly put the structure into use by using cognates, by using proper nouns and so on. So if we think about opinions, for example, as long as they learn how to say I like, they can say I like, and then they can give a name of a singer that they like, a YouTuber, and so on. If we give them a list of school subjects, for example, and they don't know any structure, they can't use that. So that's the reason why we do things that way, put things into perspective, it puts things into context. And again, they use the vocab actively, and it helps them retain it. It helps them fix it in their mind and in their memory. And so it really, as I said, it really facilitates the acquisition of vocab and long-term retention. On the next slide, we put a picture of the prefix and suffix board in our science department. I don't know how well you can see, but TA3, and it's only TA3 terms, very specific to science. They're broken down in prefixes and suffixes to show the students the links of the words, the interconnections between the words. And in languages, we always highlight similarities between certain words or roots and target vocabulary. And often we do that to elicit understanding. So instead of giving them the word and say, oh, this word means this word means that, there's also a big part of look at this word, analyze it, break it down, link it to other words that you know in this language, in another language, something that you see in another subject, to try to help them to decipher words and to just don't want to say guess the word, but figure out what they mean, which also really helps them to retain the vocabulary. So that can be done in other subjects, like evidence here, whenever possible, to show the connection that complex terms have to root words or familiar cross-subject terms. And if you think of the words like photo in art or science, which is light, you can link it to photograph, photographer, photography, photosynthesis, and so on. So the possibilities are endless, so to speak. On the next slide, we show you an example of how the Freyer model is used in our school. The Freyer model obviously is used differently in different subjects. Science and maths, particularly in our school, have really adhered to it. They find it specifically useful. And these examples here show that, in this particular activity, how pupils and teachers can use that particular structure. So in the maths example here, pupils used the Frey grid to recall the concept of a prime number. Don't ask me what it is, I don't know. But really what they do in one corner of the grid is to explain it to themselves. They find some examples, again, to explain to themselves how they work and why certain numbers match the definition. And then they also look at what counter examples of why things are not examples or non-examples, and they explain to themselves why those numbers do not match the definition. So once again, it provides words with context and immediate use, if you want, which again supports the retention of the word and the concept. And the next one on the next slide, that's from design and technology.
Yeah, so in this one, pupils are using the word, they're using the Frey model to explore the word synthetic to describe materials in a design and technology lesson. And teachers have kind of actually reported finding the use of the non-examples box on the Frey model quite useful, allowing the word itself to be linked to obviously pupils' prior knowledge of what these materials are made of or are not made of. So this model, allows pupils to put into practice and widen the application of otherwise sort of restricted and specialized words. And as Fonk said, it's particularly appreciated by teachers of more scientific subjects, we found. And it's been important to us to have this kind of flexibility in the tools that are, that we're using, that teachers have the kind of ability to choose the strategy and the tool that works best for either for their subject or for the individual lesson, for the task, for what they're actually trying to elicit from the pupils in that particular moment.
Thank you. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about retrieval, because learning is something, teaching is something, but remembering, retaining, that's obviously something else. And we know that any new knowledge will be lost if it's not revisited often, if it's not used. Again, as we said, if it's not put into context and to practice. And there's plenty of ways to do this when it comes to vocabulary. So what you can see on the screen right now is a fairly simple lesson opener exercise or activity that we ask students to do. And what we ask them to do is to recall everything that they can about the words associated with these images. Now, if you remember a couple of slides ago, the pictures there when Rachel was talking about the word imposing, for example, or amiable. Now, those images were introduced to pupils. They know them, they've seen them before, and they will connect those pictures to those words. So that dual coding helps pupils to connect the words to a cue. Here the cue is visual. And finally, they connect it to possibly an anecdote, when again Rachel was talking about imposing and linking imposing to teachers and amiable to their new context of being in a school and so on. And all those things, they really anchor the concept to the word and vice versa. On the next slide, it's very, very simple way again of revisiting and reapplying new vocab using the simple because, but, or so sentence tool that's taken from the writing revolution. Again, we didn't create anything. Everything is there. The science is there. The research is there. The books are there, and this really encourages deeper thinking about different aspects of the words and it related to the cause, to the effect. Really, drill down into what the word means and it helps the people remember what it is. On the next slide, we put a few websites or apps that I'm pretty sure that everyone is familiar with at least one of them, if not all of them. But we thought it'd be worth a mention anyway. These are some of the, a few of the interactive tools that we use in languages, but across the school as well, and particularly in English, to help with the vocabulary acquisition and also delayed retrieval. Now, these websites or apps, they help you create very, very easily in no time. You can do it in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You can create a variety of flashcards, quizzes, activities, games, plenty of very different things. And you can attach pictures to it. You can attach sounds to it. You can attach really a variety of different types of cues, and obviously a link to the vocabulary. And they provide, as I said, very, very quick activities. You can use them in, create a 2, 3, 4 minute quiz to revisit vocabulary very regularly, and that will facilitate retention. Some of them have or carry a very competitive aspect as well, and that always goes well with boys in particular, and it really helps them, brings them some motivation to try and remember those words and score better than the other team or the other players.
On the next slides, you can see that we've made vocabulary an explicit part of our end of unit or our half-termly assessments. This is in English. By having this section on vocabulary in an assessment like this, it signals to our students that vocabulary is important, and that they need to pay attention to it, they need to retain it, they need to remember and be able to use it, and that we will be coming back to it. For a lot of our students, it's an opportunity to kind of get recognition for the fact that they have paid attention and engaged with that new vocabulary. And we found that in those lessons where we have, learned a new word, pupils sometimes say things like, I actually learned something in English, because it is tangible, because it is something that makes them feel smart. They leave the lesson, knowing something. And if someone asks them, what did you do in English today? They can say, well, I learned this word. And it's been a huge kind of motivational factor. And so by tying that into assessments, we're giving pupils a chance to sort of show off that knowledge, and also to sort of build up to them being able to use these words in longer pieces of writing. It really does kind of have an impact in that way. And we talk more about impact on the next slide. So if we could move on to this one. Since we've started teaching vocabulary more explicitly in this way, we have seen increased collaboration between subject areas, not just between English and Welsh and international languages, as Wonka said, but across the school. And we really have seen increased confidence among learners when tackling challenging texts, when they are familiar with those words, when they're taught those words just before looking at a text. And we've also noticed that has strengthened some language outcomes for sort of the lower kind of third of the cohort. So obviously that we've talked, and Andy and Rachel both talked about the importance of vocabulary and closing that gap. So we have seen that evidenced as well. In some pupil voice discussions that we've had, pupils have shared that they do find these tools really helpful. We see in some of these quotes that they felt by going over some of the more difficult words before reading a complex text, they find it easier to understand the ideas or the information within the text itself. By making links between words in different subjects, different contexts, they report not only finding things easier to understand, but that they enjoy, that it made them feel smart and it gives them that confidence. And that second quote comes from a pupil in, I think it was year 7, but a pupil in an ALN class who really clearly, was excited by that and got a boost of confidence from that when we were talking about it. And pupils also find it really useful to practice using the new vocabulary in their own sentences. That they are kind of picking up that it does help them to sort of take that ownership of it and use it going forward.
And I'd like to wrap up really in 2 seconds by saying that everything we've presented, obviously, as Richard just said, we have noticed the impact. We know it makes a difference, but it's I don't want to sound like we've cracked it. It's a work in progress. And really what we know, and I'm sure it'll come to no surprise to anyone, but what we know makes a big difference, and in a very positive way, is consistency. So consistency within a department, consistency within an AOLE, and consistency within the school. And when we've got that, it really is beneficial to the pupils, because they can take, as we were saying earlier, they can take things from one subject, take it to another, reuse it, and as this pupil just said there, they feel smart. They feel that the knowledge that they've got and that they've acquired is actually useful, and that they know what to do with it, and that makes a big difference. But that's a job in itself, making sure that everyone acts consistently, and that there's clear links, clear connections between subjects, and even within subjects. It is a work in progress, but it is hugely satisfying. And that's all for us.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to hear. Thank you ever so much. Thank you both. And as we said, as we sort of expected at the beginning, I think there were some really clear threads running through, weren't there? But perhaps the one that I'm going to take away most of all is that sense of intentionality, that sense of very much planning for it deliberately, and that element that vocab has to be taught, and not assuming that it will just be caught, and thinking of it in the way as you've said, Franck, I think, seeing it in a similar light to perhaps an additional language where that intentionality has to be there, that careful planning process has to be there, and that careful pedagogy has to be there. So we have run slightly over, but I hope that there is something there of use to everybody, whatever your context, whatever the nature of your learners, and as Franck said, wherever you are in that kind of journey around the teaching of vocabulary, that there's something that you can take away and feed back into the Scarborough Reading Rope, which is where we started our conversation this afternoon, and addressing that really important strand of vocabulary for comprehension. So thank you ever so much. And if there is anything you'd like to ask, please just kind of stay on the call. And we have, as we said at the beginning, we have our Words Matter asynchronous PL, which is available via the CSC website. Thank you very much, and Prynne Hamza.